All right, go for it.
Great. Thanks. Thanks everyone for being here. I mean, when I sort of thought about the panel discussion, I kind of thought of an open format. Mostly, I think what we'll be talking about are sort of open sort of questions more than sort of solutions that we've had. I also realized that, many languages is the many babies amongst the many X groups. We are the youngest sort of ManyX program here. So I think we have a lot to learn. But hopefully, between Matt and I, we're going to be able to, probably point out like issues that we've had, struggles that we've sort of gone through, possible solutions, and then of course things that haven't really worked out, right? So I mean, the way that we structured it, I mean, obviously we have a lot to learn from the other ManyX programs, projects, if you will. And essentially, we followed the BTS structure. We're trying to sort of within sort of language sciences, trying to see how we can operationalize, democratize selection of studies, things which should seem kind of intuitive and sort of stuff that we should be doing. But I suppose all of it needs some level of reiteration, if you will. Yeah, so I think the way that I thought that we could sort of frame the discussion would be the sort of the trifecta of inclusion. By inclusion, we sort of both mean sort of scientific inclusion in the sense that what kind of studies should be included, and also a sort of extra scientific stuff, if you will, which involves including populations, demographics, not just sort of academics, but also activists and so on, right? And then, of course, be able to scale the studies that we are looking into. How do we sort of make sure that they're not siloed off somewhere, something that we can sort of, which is kind of crucially related to the notion of outreach. And by outreach, again, the idea being that we want to be, it's sort of related to these, all of these three concepts are kind of related. We want to have, I suppose, we want to be able to build for a sustainable future of these democratized studies, build sort of outreach networks, if you will, that are going to be deployable and also sustainable, right? So when we move from, let's say, one project to the other, we should be able to utilize that infrastructure in order to be able to, do the next study, right? Like the next, iteration of the study, or whichever way it is. So coming to the perspective from many languages, we know that, there are about more than, 6,000 languages. But when we look at the number of studies, what we basically find is that a very small number of a very, very small number of a very small number of languages are kind of represented. So if you looked at this picture, you'll get a sense of how skewed or how not well represented so many populations and languages are. So the Many Languages Project, therefore, is sort of very, very keen on making sure that we are able to somehow bridge this gap. Everybody's familiar with the weird problem. I don't need to probably stress on that. But in general, behavioral sciences have been sort of plagued with this the weird problem, and some of the workarounds that have come about, haven't really yet managed to sort of address these issues, right? So there are studies which basically show that if you compare weird populations with other types of populations, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's a workaround, right? So in other words, weird populations or problems are not a benchmark against which you can operationalize other studies. So in what we do in many languages is that we are trying to engage with long-standing questions in language sciences. This could be sort of any part of language science. And the approach that we have is the BTS approach, the big team sciences approach, so that we can have, more better rigor and wider sort of, or, breadth of information about the studies that we work on. In general, we follow sort of transparent procedures, in terms of publishing, whether it be the procedures that we have, everything is kind of in the open science framework. And so obviously, if we are going to be supporting projects, and those projects are basically, going to make sure that they share data, code, materials, and so on. Also, of course, we are responsive. We try to be, welcoming towards criticism, feedback, and so on. These are just sort of stuff that everybody within the ManyX projects knows about, right? Right now, we are running the Many Tones, which is basically our first sort of, democratically selected study, if you will. And we just heard from Chense just a couple of hours back about how that study is being done. Essentially, it's a replication of a landmark study. And so, I mean, those of us, if you're familiar with sort of language sciences, typically, studies would be on a set of languages, perhaps no more than 3 or 4 languages, at best, maybe 10 or 15 languages. So in some ways, a vast majority of the languages remain underrepresented. And so therefore, when you have generalizations or you have findings, they don't tend to generalize across many languages. And so the idea here is to be able to take a landmark study and be able to replicate it in a sort of a scaled up fashion, if you will. So we have an online web-based perception study that is hopefully going to get deployed very soon, so that we can have representation from many sort of linguistic communities and geographical areas. This should help us basically, look back into the landmark study and be able to say whether findings that we had sort of replicate across many languages, right? So we also have, we're also looking into sort of musical training background and how that sort of impacts the results. I think now, if I'm not mistaken, Matt is gonna take over, right?
Yes, and I'll cover the next few slides. Indranil, particularly if you have comments from your experience so far with many tones, you could certainly interject, because something I'll point out throughout these slides is that in many languages so far, we have a lot more challenges or ideas about what the challenges will be compared to very, very concrete solutions that we know represent best practices for addressing them. But we see there as being 2 really big challenges, I guess, one of which is sort of addressing scalability. We want to be able to include a large number of different languages, probably at a range of different sites, since most languages are not conveniently located. And there's significant empirical and logistical challenges of scaling projects up, and that's mostly what I'll be discussing today. Any solutions that I might bring up are sort of aspirational in nature and probably could work. One of these, the solutions that we do have probably reflect various top-down decisions that project leadership has to make in terms of placing limitations on scope of the study that are in keeping with the nature of the research questions, or on the flip side, allowing for some tolerance and variation from site to site. But either way, there's a few key things it seems like are going to need to happen. One is that if you design a protocol for carrying out a study and people will be following it in many different locations, you have to account for a lot of variation, and your protocol therefore has to be very simple, adaptable, and sustainable is the word we've got here. I might also say robust to cultural variation. That is sort of a major issue in working with adult humans and the languages that they speak. We also want to refer to any frameworks that might exist that generalize beyond single many something initiatives when it's possible. Example given here is many babies replication networks, but if people can think of anything that would be supportive of the sort of activity that we're talking about, that would be great. Next slide, please. Now, big team studies that take place in language sciences under many languages, these have to adapt to a very wide variety of sites, probably, for the simple reason that I'm putting already that most languages are not conveniently located. And if you want to actually generalize quite a bit beyond the commonly studied languages, which you might need to do for various theoretically driven reasons, then you do in fact need to account for a lot more variation than is commonly treated, I think, in certain big team studies that involve human behavior. But the fact that language is involved is another major issue for designing study protocols that are robust to all of these different locations. For example, stimulus materials need to be localized, not just in a cultural sense, but also to the language that you are working on. You cannot have, a study run in English because that may actually bias the results substantially. And you might need to consider whether you're using a vehicular language at all. In some cases, the writing system that you happen to use is going to impact production and processing of the materials in subtle ways. There's structural variation in the languages themselves, which need to be dealt with. If you're studying some syntactic phenomenon, for instance, you may need to somehow control for the fact that the constructions that exist in various languages are just apples and oranges. They're not terribly easy to compare to each other in sort of a so there would be an issue of the theoretical construct that you're studying in some cases. And in some cases, this leads to problems as fundamental as figuring out what your conditions are for an experiment from place to place. You may not be able to get away with using written stimuli at all in some places because you may need to assume that in some places you will be working with illiterate populations who cannot read in the target language. There's also, for what it's worth, if you're working on signed languages, a pretty strong bias against writing down or otherwise representing in text signed language content. This is mostly to do with, as I understand it, wanting to avoid influence from spoken languages and just kind of having a preference for visual modality of a signer signing more so than a text-based representation. Another big issue is that, of course, and I think this is the one that could be expected if you're doing a study with sites all over the world, what counts as a neutral set of materials or a neutral set of procedures has to account for a very wide variety of cultural differences. And to some extent, you even need to account for cultural differences in whether people are used to sitting down and doing experiments of a certain sort at a computer at all. Next slide. At any rate, like I say earlier, any solutions to this range of problems, we don't have a lot of concrete best practices picked out just yet, other than to accept that you need to be prepared to make your protocols adaptable and to at least some extent flexible, or at least allowing for a range of different options at different sites. There is also the issue when you include diverse sites of variation in these sites themselves. I think people don't necessarily, in their mental representation of things, assume that this includes laboratory spaces, or at least there's a common cultural assumption that I get into in a second, where people sort of assume that the lab is the gold standard and you can't do much better than the lab. But any recording site where speech is recorded, including laboratory sites, can have unmanageable confounds that are introduced. For example, the mere presence of different people running the study at the recording sites who have different social orientations to the population that they're working with and different language backgrounds and different languages of communication before the study begins might subtly influence the various outcomes of the study, especially if social cues are important to something to do with the study. The acoustic characteristics of the recording space are known to be pretty important for production and perception. If you happen to record someone in a sound booth at one site, but you record someone in a fairly reverberant room, an echoey room in another space, they're going to perceive and produce things somewhat differently. There's a very amusing study cited here. If you record somebody sitting in a car, this is Heidi et al. 2017. If you record people sitting in a car saying things, they pronounce these things slightly differently and say them slightly louder compared to if they are in a laboratory. And this is because when you're in a car, you're used to talking over the engine noise of a car and the road noise. So little details like this can, in fact, leak into the data that you collect, and you have to be careful about normalizing your spaces to the extent that that is possible. A bit more expected is that you have to make sure that your equipment is comparable. Different microphones can give wildly different acoustic parameters if you record the same speech event in the same space. On top of all of the other confounds that I mentioned, you do have to try to make sure that the equipment that you're using to collect data is somewhat similar from place to place. Next slide. This all sort of leads me to a point that we make in a position paper that is in press or hopefully appearing sometime soon. That there's a very common sort of trade-off that I think that we see between constraining your protocol to be easily operationalized and very rigorous. But in the case of something like many languages, we have to be careful that we're not restricting ourselves to the same slice of linguistic diversity that we have already very heavily investigated. For at least certain types of studies. Maybe for certain replications or meta-analyses, we are comfortable working in the space that we've already heavily explored, but in at least a few cases, we do need to expand outside of this space. And so we want to resist the reflexive urge, I think, to make everything so rigorous that it excludes a lot of this variation that we might want to otherwise work in. So you need to consider how much site variation you can handle in your particular study design, instead of just assuming that it should all be immediately ruled out. In other words, find the dimensions that matter for your study and limit the variation in those, perhaps. Next slide. Now, we also have goals for inclusivity. This was one of the big bullet points at the start that Indranil introduced. And we want to ensure representative parity in a project like Many Languages, not just in samples and where the samples are recorded, but we also want to include researcher participation from different parts of the world. The so-called global north, global south divide it plays pretty big in what we're doing, because we've noticed the kind of glaring observation that a lot of our people are from the global north, practically all of them, in fact. And if we want to make the language sciences, and especially the big team language sciences, more generally useful to the rest of the world, it stands to reason we should include the rest of the world. We also want to promote a diversity of ideas and themes. We want to avoid dominance of global north priorities in the cases where that is possible. We want to see what the global south's priorities may be for carrying out studies of this sort. We also want to justify, rather than just arbitrarily do it, including or excluding languages and placing limitations that effectively result in limits on researcher demographics, particularly the geographic place that they are working, I would say. We want to aim for equity in north-south collaborations, as we could call them. We want to move beyond a purely extractive model where we work with somebody in the global south, get their data, and then move on. We really want to emphasize skill sharing to the extent that it's possible. And we want to especially emphasize shared ownership of ideas and outcomes in that sense. Next slide. So if we want to lean towards inclusivity, which, as the little diagram up here notes, is sort of a piece with having a broad sample of languages in different places, you need to include various fairly diverse sites. This is crucial, I think, at least. This is maybe my position and not the position of everybody on Many Languages. but my background's a little different. I think it's crucial for seriously addressing the weird problem to at least put an effort in to expand beyond the same narrow slice of languages that we've already worked with. If you come up with a really strict protocol, you're going to end up excluding some sites, and you're going to exclude the researchers who work at them from participating in your big team science project. For example, if you have really strict rules on the recording circumstances, say you insist on a sound booth, then you're going to completely exclude a large swath of the people who practice this sort of work globally. Even if you're not doing that, you should probably take pains to confirm for people what the criteria for participating actually are, especially if they are not as narrow as one might assume, because certain people are going to self-exclude from this work on the assumption that these finicky people from the global north are not possibly going to be tolerant of the way that they happen to be able to collect data. And in general, I think that potential collaborators are going to be discouraged from even looking into big team science if they think that they don't have resources that let them participate in it, or they can't satisfy the super rigid protocols that they imagine to exist. There's a lot of research, particularly in genomics and other wet lab sciences, on kind of north-south collaborations in this way that have confirmed, at least in a meta-scientific sense, right, that scientists working in Africa in particular often have to deal with these issues. My area is Africa, so I'm particularly attuned to that. Now, something I want to zoom in on for a couple of minutes before we get to the other parts of the panel is a phrasing that comes up a lot, at least informally and possibly sometimes formally in some protocols, which is that, you know, a lab is what joins a big team science project. And I want to stop for a second and think, well, what is a lab actually? And language science work is pretty low overhead in a lot of cases relative to a lot of other big team science projects. And we probably want to ask ourselves if a lab is even necessary for language science work in some cases. Next slide. So there's a sort of straw man that, well, or whatever the better term would be here, but there's a sort of imagined archetype of a scientist that I think people often have in their head. They're sort of, you know, they're the mad genius working in a laboratory which is full of fantastical equipment, right? And, you know, whether or not we literally think that to be true for our particular subfield, there's certainly this social idea that people receive. It probably leads a lot of people to ask, well, if I don't have a lab, how am I supposed to contribute to a project like this? I don't really have dedicated facilities. I can get a quiet room and proper equipment, but I don't have anything like, you know, this anechoic chamber pictured here. But the lab is interesting. It occupies this almost mystical position in science. Meta-science studies for a while have gotten into how the lab is this interesting cultural construct. And the behavioral sciences, from time to time, just come directly out and say that lab speech is sort of this invariant gold standard that we want to compare things to. I think people have more moderate positions, certainly, but you see this come out every once in a while. So the lab as a perceived barrier could be an issue. Next slide. What you might actually need some of the time is just some minimal requirements that allow you to collect fairly standardized data across a wide range of sites. So it turns out probably all that you need for a lot of big team language science studies is a quiet room. In some cases, depending on the construction materials of the room, you might have to retrofit it. My field site is pictured in the two images at left, or at least one of the rooms at my field site. And I have taken the incredible effort of retrofitting these with foam mattresses leaned up against the walls, which are a sort of crude but effective form of sound attenuation. So that the room doesn't echo and you can record pretty good audio data with it. So it would be suitable, in other words, for something like, I'd say, most big team science studies that involve speech production and acoustic recording. Of course, you have to train people, if you're working remotely with people at some far off site, to actually fix the rooms like this or to pick the right room in the first place. You have to train them, you know, maybe on a few other things here and there, and you may have to provision equipment. But the basics are there. In certain cases, I'd also say BTS projects should be open to unexpected affordances, let's call them. So one would think, for example, that a traditional wood and grass hut in the middle of the Amazon, as pictured at right, probably wouldn't be a great space to record, but in fact, it's probably a lot better than the room that I record in Cameroon, because it doesn't reverberate, and actually all of the soft materials are really, really good for field recording. The thatched roof doesn't rustle, just dampens the sound quite nicely. So you can use a grass hut like a sound booth. And you have to allow for some of these unexpected affordances in the design of your projects, is one thing that I might suggest. Maybe we can talk about that with the panel, I don't know. But the next slide goes back to Indranil, I believe. And we're almost done here. Unmute.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Matt. That was really great. So we are basically at the sort of final part of the trifecta, which is the outreach. Incidentally, both Matt and I had, the outreach efforts for many languages. And most of the times, I suppose we, end up failing than succeeding. And so, of course, it should not be lost on our community that, why do we want to do this outreach, right? I mean, is it because of the fact that we're kind of, doing some kind of social justice kind of a thing? That's not really the case. The reason for outreach and to be able to involve diverse linguistic communities is to be able to make sort of language sciences inclusive and robust, right? So the findings that we have, and we have involvement from diverse communities, are always hold up, much better in a robust manner compared to findings that we've had, when such is not the case, right? So when we are talking about outreach, we're talking about sort of not just researchers. We're also thinking about open science activists and also underrepresented institutions. So it's not just restricted to people, but also community-based groups that could be involved, right? So for now, within many languages, we have a global network of 280 researchers. In the last couple of years, we've had 7 expressions of interest which have been submitted since the time that we started many languages. We have 1 accepted proposal. As you know, we are going through the many tones iteration. And I believe that we have 3 proposals which are in the final stages of review through our second call for proposals. So in some ways, we are making sort of steady progress, but there are some, issues that need to be ironed out. All of these proposals we've had so far have been from the Global North. We are yet to receive proposals from the Global South. So in some sense, we have this network of 280 researchers, but the idea is to be able to activate full participation in terms of team membership and also in terms of leadership roles in a manner that's sort of equitable. What that means is that, it wouldn't matter if we still had a strong network and, we had sort of passive members who did not, from whom, one, the proposals were not originating, or they were not actively participating in the work that we were sort of doing, right? So I think one of the major issues for us is increasing engagement in this sort of network, that we already have, and also, operationalize this notion of the inside network basically being able to do stuff outside. So, we've had sort of many difficulties, as we know that, there's sort of, there's generally a bias against sort of multiple authored publications and collaborations in formal linguistics. Typically, you have single authored papers, especially in some sort of theoretical disciplines. And so you have the sort of a lone wolf approach, where you've got this, the speaker communities are not a part of the the actual research that takes place. So in that sense, the BTS approach is sort of more amenable in terms of being able to help us achieve these kinds of goals. And so we are hoping that we are going to be able to get something positively out of it. And one of the major challenges is to have as I mentioned earlier, have an effective and also sustainable outreach effort amongst colleagues who are in lower income global South countries, and how do we sort of achieve those? Matt is basically authoring this position paper that he mentioned earlier. All of the outreach work that we basically started at the International Congress of Phonetic Sciences in Prague in 2023. And that's where we sort of all kind of got together. We have to recognize that, again, this was at the International Congress of Phonetic Sciences, which is already quite inaccessible for a large number of language sciences scientists or speech scientists especially. So we are already sort of talking to each other in an echo chamber, if you will. And so it's not ideal as a site from where so you're always then in that case like reaching out really. So we were sort of recruiting people in a kind of a like-minded manner, which is fine. I mean, I guess for us, for starting up, that's not a bad place to be. But then it kind of hits a stop, right? You don't get to evangelize beyond that. So you can sort of maybe connect like a couple of nodes, but that's where it sort of stops, right? So this particular paper that Matt is also authoring amongst several other people, I believe only has 3 authors who are in the global South. So in some ways we don't have any representation from lesser represented institutions in the global North even. So for what that means is that we don't have community-based or institutions which are basically serving minorities or tribal universities or other sort of deaf-centered institutions within this sort of enterprise. And we're also not engaging outside of institutions, right? So it's all sort of academic institutions in that sense. And language is basically something that affects everybody. It's not really something that's tied to an academic institution in that sense. So, so what we are trying to think is, that let's not sort of think in terms of this in reach, right? I mean, like if you're basically going to talk to each other, echoing sort of our calls within sort of familiar settings, then to expect that some sort of magical outreach is going to happen, it's obviously not going to happen that way. Also, the sites for these things are basically extremely expensive in-person conferences, which basically already make it difficult for people from the global South, to not just obtain visas, but also find funding and so on. And it just gets sort of expensive at that level. It's expensive for even people from the global North, but in general, it's an expensive enterprise, right? So what we are sort of thinking, and we're just sort of spitballing here, and that is to think in terms of skill sharing or share tasks. And as Matt mentioned earlier, that this kind of move away from this kind of an extractive model, how to sort of have true engagement at a community level, and have sort of in some ways sort of bring in sort of field workers who are already working in the field in a way that's sort of more constructive, right? And so one of the things that we have been sort of thinking about or talking about even is sort of incentive structures. We seem to I think disregard one thing, and we have to understand that the incentive structures within which people function in different institutions in different geographies are very, very different. And so we have to have an acknowledgement of that. And secondly, we've got to be able to address that, right? So we've got to figure out our efforts have to be, sort of in line with what the incentive structures are for a specific site, right? And then based on that, having sensitivity towards that, we can sort of probably think of a better outreach in that sense. So moving forward, obviously money, that's something that it's something that we are working towards. Whatever efforts we have, we try to, if we ever find a possibility of applying for grants, small grants, then we do engage with that. And this is something that Matt also feels very strongly about, which is training and skill sharing. And making sure that in terms of equipment and data collection, whatever, we have some sort of parity, which essentially means that if you're going to go and write up a grant, then make sure that you have enough money that you can buy a small piece of equipment that can go into a field site, right, and stay there so that you can keep collecting data from there. So it's not sort of surprising, therefore, that there's very little effort, in these sites for people to volunteer, because of the fact that it's tied to the notion of the fact that the incentive structures are not clear, and that's something that we need to sort of work on. So I suppose, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what we had in mind. And I guess, I mean, you'll have some time for, Drew and Heidi to maybe comment on what their sort of insights are on this. Because as I said, that we are the youngest ManyX program here, project here. So we certainly would like to, get your feedback on how you guys tackle some of this stuff if you do encounter them, right? So I'll just stop here.
Thank you. Yeah, really great overview of a lot of the challenges that many of our groups face. Drew, do you have any, I know you have a ton of experience thinking about these challenges and addressing them with many primates. Do you want to jump in and offer thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. I won't get into too much about many primates itself. You can come see the talk tomorrow if you want to learn more about that. But basically, we operate a big team science network where we study kind of fundamental aspects of animal cognition, particularly primate cognition. And so, yeah, for us, like the inclusivity aspect of it is really sits sort of at the center of a lot of what we've been thinking about lately. Like for us, these ideas of sort of inclusivity and sustainability and scalability all kind of run together. And I feel like we're sort of in the situation we're sort of on. I don't know if there's an inflection point, but even though we're technically the longest running and probably the largest of the animal-oriented projects, it still feels like we're quite a small project. And that's often feels like that's not something we have a whole lot of control over, because we are in like a lot of ways at the mercy of like the local situations of our members. And some of that has to do with just what's going on with people in the global north with their academic situation, but a lot has to do with the kind of research sites and field sites and sanctuaries around the world that we engage in. And if the things are changing there, there's nothing necessarily that we can do. Plus, the fact that everyone who engages in these projects is a volunteer makes a big difference to who can get involved and for how long and in what capacity. And in that way, the micro grants idea, I think, is really interesting. The other thing about us is because we study multiple species. I mean, it's really striking for us because we are, again, most of our researchers are based in the global north. We don't all come from there, but tend to find our way to institutions in the global north. But most of the species are native to parts of the global south. Most of the ones we study tend to be in zoos that are still in the north. So we have some sanctuaries and other sites we want to be working with and keep working with in the global south. So there are multiple points of divide for us where it becomes harder for us to be more engaged with like our collaborators and our colleagues who are in the south. And then a lot of that comes down to what are the priorities. And I think you guys said a lot of great stuff about the incentives. A lot of that is really similar as well. And in the primate world, a lot of it is just about like kind of bare priorities, and that a lot of these species are threatened where they are, where they live alongside the people in Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia particularly. A lot of it is about just conservation, and the people who really care about these animals, people who want to study them, kind of need to be putting their resources and time into understanding how they can conserve these animals and build partnerships and relationships with the growing human communities around. And where they can engage in more interesting and sort of cognitive research, they do, but the opportunities are just not there as much. So yeah, for us, thinking about that scalability does kind of come back to sustainability, because we need to maintain a kind of critical mass in order to keep momentum in the projects, as well as to power like the statistics. In order to power the phylogenetic analysis we do, we need to have a kind of critical mass. So it's something we're always thinking about, something we're always trying to do. We don't really have a whole lot of resources for that, and it isn't something that can be at the top of any particular person's list. Again, because of teaching issues and so on. And I think it's interesting to look at many languages and think about how and I might be simplifying this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but when you guys go to your field sites and you go to places where you're going to study these languages, you're interacting with the people around the world, usually in their native languages, and you're communicating with that in that way. And so you have this sort of thing in common that you're talking about, and you're trying to research and understand the languages. Whereas what we're doing is we're going and we're trying to understand. We're both trying to understand something we want to talk about, which is the primates. We're both interested in the primates and how they are getting on and their status and what they know. But we still have the language barrier, and we're not language experts. So there are these big linguistic and even, I'm sure, cultural issues at play that are even maybe to further disadvantage. But it would be really interesting to kind of try and understand what the difference is and what things like we can learn from many languages, which it seems to have more expertise in this area because of the subject matter, but also from the Psych Science Center and Many Babies, because you guys have been doing this kind of stuff across the world for longer, and hopefully maybe more successfully in some domains. I could go on for a bit, but I'll stop for now and hand it off.
Yeah, I'll jump in and sort of just say that, we at Many Babies have faced all of these same challenges and struggled to come up with solutions to all of them. We've tried out some things that I could go into in more detail, but before I do, I want to put a plug in. Tomorrow, one of the first sessions of the day is a hackathon that's let's see, it's called Promoting Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Big Team Social Sciences. So we at Many Babies, so Kylie Hamlin, who's here in the Zoom today, is one of the directors of this a grant that we recently got with from Canada's Social Science Research Arm funding agency to a partnership grant where Many Babies, Many Primates, and some of the other many groups, the Psychological Science Accelerator, are coming together to sort of share knowledge and try and develop like strategies for improving how we operate. And this sort of scaling, inclusivity, representation is a big part of that process. So Tomorrow it's 1 p.m. UTC. I know off the top of my head that it's 6 a.m. Pacific time. So, and a more reasonable time for pretty much everyone else in the world. So come join us. We'll be talking about potential solutions. We did get a small but not insignificant chunk of money to be able to put towards some of these things. And so part of that discussion tomorrow will be sort of the best way to use that money. Unfortunately, a lot of these funding agencies don't want to just give you a pot of money that you can then send out around the world in the form of micro grants. They like to keep things either within the country that they're funding or have it be much more controlled. So that's like an issue that we're constantly fighting against, because we also love this idea of micro grants. But depending on where the money's coming from, there are lots of restrictions on being able to do that. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. And I can also talk more about some of the things we at Many Babies have done to try and address some of these issues if people would like, but I'll let others jump back in.
I just want to add really quickly, please come to the EDI hackathon. And there's also on Wednesday, there's another hackathon about training and knowledge mobilization that's also coming out of the Connect partnership. And I think these two things, the EDI and the training and the knowledge mobilization, go together really well and should go together. So I think please come along to that as well.
I'll briefly chime in that don't feel bad, Indranil. It took the PSA 8+ years to get something from the Global South. So we're struggling with the same types of things, making sure that our incentive structures are aligned appropriately to get even submissions from different parts of the world. So.
Yeah, I think it really does all boil down to the incentive structure. Part of that is money, part of that can be other things in terms of, publications, just being able to ask the types of questions that you're interested in rather than contributing to the research questions that, the Global North has asked historically. But without providing some type of incentive, why should people want to participate in these projects? Not to just get like a pin on a map. And so, yeah, like we really need to work on improving and addressing these incentives. I think that's really what it comes down to. Like,
And somebody has a hand up. Go ahead instead of me.
Oh yeah, so I was just wondering about the experience that the other guys, the other networks have with regards. I mean, the incentive problem is a big problem, right? But we feel like we don't even get in touch with the people. We try to, reach out to national associations. So Indranil has done a lot of legwork there. And correct me if I'm wrong, you got 0 responses. Is that correct? Yeah, so just the first contact, it might be related obviously to the incentive system that we do not convince them in that approach to even contact us back, but it feels like there's another communication wall that makes even the connection really, really difficult. That's something we struggle with at the moment. So I wonder what you guys did or what your experience is with this.
Are you asking me or the whole group?
Many
apes,
many babies, obviously you.
I think Matt wanted to say something, but I'll just start by saying that when we're thinking about incentives, we have to sort of think about sort of intellectual incentives more than sort of monetary or material. I think it's important to basically converge in terms of ideas. And I think that's what we struggle with, right? I mean, if it's a message that's coming from me to the national organizations, then it's like a cold email, and it doesn't make sense to any of these national organizations as to why am I trying to reach out to them, right? But I think it has to be, so we need sort of participants, we need people to participate in our process rather than reaching out to them and telling them that, hey, listen, here's a project that we want to do and we need your help. So it's I think in some ways we need to think of the incentive structure such that we are converging intellectually at some point, right? Yeah, I mean, that's sort of my best way of thinking about it. Matt has something to say, I suppose. Yeah.
Oh, very quick. Like a lot of the incentive structures that people are dealing with, who we're trying to reach out to, are just systematic in origin or systemic in origin. Basically, a lot of times the issue is the university that people happen to work for. And this is sort of the lurking problem that to some extent we're not going to be able to fix by reaching out with the correctly worded proposal. I'm familiar with a lot of universities in Nigeria or Cameroon, for example, that will sort of have a quota system by which, to get the local equivalent of tenure, you have to publish a certain amount of publications that reach certain types of venues. It doesn't particularly matter how you publish them, just that they get published. But they don't let papers with like a certain number of authors or higher count towards that. And sometimes there may also be subfield restrictions that this would be more an issue for students, like advanced students, than for professors. But because the language sciences are a very internally diverse area, lots of people studying the same thing with different methods, sometimes the people that you're reaching out to, the people who supervise them may not agree with you that what you're doing falls within the remit of the department that they're in, and they may therefore not be allowed to participate in this research. For example, whether phonetics counts as linguistics is a surprisingly contentious question around the world. And you get places like Europe that say, kind of no, but we're going to put it in the same department next door and it all works. And then you have places like North America that say, yeah, it's basically linguistics. And then you have the whole rest of the world that sort of says, this stuff, linguistics? No. Like, never heard of it. Not never heard of it. Never heard of anyone in my department working on it. So like, that's kind of what you're competing against here. If you come around saying, be part of my giant experiment, there's a good chance that the person you're reaching out to has no incentive to take part, not just in any giant study, but in like an experimental study at all. So there's a lot of systemic things that we're working against too. It's why the grants come up again. It's why skill sharing comes up again. It's like we have to offer bigger carrots to people, effectively, to get them interested in stepping outside of the conventional boundaries and maybe involving themselves with these projects. It's just a pity that the carrots are very difficult to offer across national borders.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in. One thing I was thinking about during both of those last sets of comments is not only do you have to be creative about like who you're reaching out to, but you have to be flexible with like the method of outreach as well. I mean, this is not so relevant to the initial outreach, but we had a project that's actually just finishing up where we did an extension of one of our projects focusing on researchers in Africa, extending an already completed project. And the leaders of that project found that like trying to communicate by email was just not very effective, but WhatsApp was a much more effective communication method. And so, we in the US are not necessarily used to running research projects via WhatsApp, but that's what worked for that group. So you have to just be aware of that, of those different means of operating, and be flexible and adaptive to those things. We're nearing the end of our time slot, I think. Does anybody have any final questions or thoughts that they want to share with the group? Oh, thanks, Dana. Thanks for sharing in the chat. And I will also say, yes, one more plug. Please do come to that hackathon tomorrow. It's in the schedule. It's row 28 in your handy BTSCON schedule with all of the links, because yeah, we'll basically be continuing this discussion there, and again trying to come up with some actual practical steps that we can take across all of our networks to improve. All right. With that,
so
I will
much.
thank my fellow panelists, especially Indranil, for taking the lead and sharing all of that. And Matt, thank you for sharing. And we will see you tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.